I'm David Gallagher. I'm the CEO of the Centre for International Finance and Regulation. Today we're interviewing two scholars, Professor David Yermack from NYU Stern and Professor Ray de Silva from the University of Western Australia. Both researchers are doing research work on two strikes policy, which is internationally relevant and specifically important in Australia today. So Professor Yermack, why is executive compensation such an important topic?
I think executive compensation is important because managers respond to incentives. That if we understand that managers have bonus plans to reward increases in the stock price or earnings per share or maybe gains in market share, this gives us insight into how they're going to run the firm, what their strategy will be. And this is really important for shareholders, competitors, other people in the organization. Ultimately, it's said that people will manage what is measured. And if you're rewarding people on the basis of a certain variable, firms will try to produce more of that variable. And that's where incentive compensation plays the role in directing people's efforts.
So Ray, have you got any sort of other insights when it comes to executive compensation?
It's not just a corporate finance puzzle, as it were, but it's also a political issue. When Theresa May, the new Prime Minister of Britain, the Conservative Prime Minister of Britain at that, comes in and identifies executive pay as one of the major reforms she intends to introduce, this was in the back of the Brexit, you know that this is something that's really a hot button issue politically. So yes, for a variety of reasons, not just corporate finance, it is an important issue.
So in Australia, we have a two strikes policy, which is designed to avoid excessive pay and giving shareholders an ability to correct that kind of incentive structure. What are your views about Australia's approach when it comes to the two strikes policy?
Yeah, it's very different than other countries have taken, and I think in a very good way. You've had countries adopt these say-on-pay votes since 2002 when the UK first introduced this, and it spread to the US and most of the countries in Western Europe. But almost always they sort of put the focus on the manager who maybe has accepted more pay than they deserve. To my mind, the real issue is that the board has written a bad contract in most of these cases, and that the focus really shouldn't be blaming the manager for taking the money, but you should be blaming the directors who write the contract. And so what the two strikes rule does is leads through a series of votes to ultimately the board itself is being held accountable. That if 2 years in a row the company's shareholders refuse to endorse the board's compensation scheme, the board is then spilled from office and must itself stand for re-election. So putting the focus on the board and holding the board accountable for its own decisions is really quite novel, and I think really the correct way to focus the energies of a reform like this.
So in terms of the two strikes policy, why is it necessary? Because in the old days, even up till now, 5% of shareholders could actually seek to amend changes here.
This is a very good question because you can vote individual directors out of office already, and shareholders have other opportunities to intervene with executive compensation. So a share plan typically has to be authorized by separate vote. So in many ways, this duplicates rights that shareholders already have, not just in Australia, but in other countries. I think what it does is focus attention on the issue. It provides a focal point for protest. And I think this is very much a shaming kind of reform that you really want to create a setting where the board has to be held accountable for this one issue in a very direct and very public way. But logically, there's no real need for this because shareholders, if they're truly upset and concerned, they've always had the opportunity to intervene in different ways and still do, in fact.
I might just add a note of that, a slight, not so much a disagreement, but I think an issue that's often overlooked is the cost of undertaking shareholder action and the market frictions in effect. And so one of the roles of regulation is perhaps to reduce a particular market friction in an area where we think they're excessive. Now it's arguable whether executive pay is one of those places where we need so much attention paid because arguably the shareholders elect boards to make those decisions on complex, nuanced issues. You could say that if a shareholder's second-guessing a board, then perhaps they've got other bigger problems, given that they don't trust the board. But as a general principle, I think this concept of a friction, you might have regulations to smooth frictions, and that's an important role for corporate law.
So you both have been doing some CIFR-funded research with Professor Terry Walter. What does the data show and what are some of the areas of investigation that you've done?
What you find in Australia is similar to other countries, which is that shareholders are not nearly as upset about this issue on a company by company basis, as you might believe from reading the press, that in the overwhelming number of companies, the report of the company is ratified and it's really business as usual. It's a small handful of companies that are really the focus of investor attention. I think this is by far the most important result, not just in Australia, but in every country that's held these votes, is that shareholders are really much more satisfied with the system than you might imagine.
It's also important to bear in mind that since the two strikes law came in 2011, however, since 1998, companies have been required to report on the executive remuneration. And in 2004, shareholders have had an opportunity to advise the board on what they think about executive pay. So we've had a lot of opportunity over the years for both the directors to learn what the shareholders think and for also the shareholders to identify what's appropriate pay for executives given the publicly available information that's around. So in a sense, we might not have expected much change at all as a result of the two strikes rule. But that's what we certainly set out to see if there is in fact any change.
And Ray, what's the data period and how many observations are we talking about?
So we've looked at the two strikes law came in 2011, and we've looked at the 3-year period till 2013. So we've so that's a 4-year interval. We've had some companies in our sample that have had 4 strikes against them, in fact. But in total, we've looked at around 4,125 elections involving those two strikes. Yeah.
What you see in these elections is only 7% of the time do shareholders seem to be objecting. And it's worth keeping in mind that Australia actually requires 75% approval. In most countries, it's 50%. But here you have, even with a 75% hurdle, almost 93% of the companies get over that hurdle. And then if you look at the set of about 300 companies that did get a first strike, only about 1 in 6, only about 50 proceeded then to get a second strike in the next year. And then finally, from that group with the 2 strikes, the vast majority of directors have then been returned to office. We found only 8 individual directors, most of whom actually resigned rather than facing the vote. But it's really only a small handful of people who've actually been sanctioned in any way for the shareholder votes in this area. So, again, overwhelming approval at both the first stage, and even if you miss the first stage, most firms seem to be fixing by the second year whatever the problem might be.
The caveat, the thing to bear in mind is, of course, that all you need, while you might require to have to pass the 75% hurdle for approval of executive pay, you only need 50% to reappoint the board. So if you have a simple majority of shareholders approving of the board's performance, a director could still get re-elected despite having had a strike against him. So that might be reflected in the numbers that we show. A lot more board spills, well, not a lot more, but just 12 board spills, and ultimately just 8 directors voted out of office.
I think there are some interesting quirks in the law here that once you get to the board spill, 2 things are true. One, as Raymond said, the threshold is reduced from 75 to 50%. But you also have shareholders on the inside who are not allowed to vote on the compensation, but they are then permitted to re-enter the process and vote. Often it may be the managers themselves who can't vote on their pay, but can vote to return themselves to office. So I didn't fully understand this when the law took effect, that the rules basically change in the late stages of this, and that when you get to the board spill, it's much, much easier to return a board to office that may even be unable to get the 75% approval, but just due to its own voting power, probably has a big cushion that will get it past the 50%. I think ultimately, if you wanted the law to have more teeth, these regulations may need to be revisited.
Yeah, ultimately, it's the way the law is presently structured. It's the notoriety, rather the embarrassment, if you like, of a strike.
The shaming part of it.
Yeah. That's the punishment. And if a board's happy to ride that out, or more importantly, if the majority of the shareholders are happy to ride that out, then you could say that the sanctions have no teeth, or this.
One thing that will be interesting is to look at those directors who were involved in perhaps a second strike, and then look down the road maybe 5 years into the future and see what has happened to their careers. Do they have fewer board mandates than they might have expected? In other words, are there reputational consequences downstream in the market for directors? Not enough time has passed to answer that question yet. We'll have to wait and see. But really, that if there are reputational penalties, it should show up in how these people's careers unfold, whether they really do bear any costs a year, 5 years into the future.
So, David, given that we may need some more data, do you have a hunch about what you might find?
I think it's likely that these people will pay a price in the market downstream. We have lots of data from the US about directors who are involved in merger decisions or decisions about whether to retain or fire underperforming CEOs. And you definitely see spillover effects that these people tend to either acquire or lose other board seats depending on how they perform as directors of any one company that becomes a focal point for shareholder action. So I would think you would see reputational consequences in this market as well. It's just that we need the passage of time to get the data and to document this.
So what is the empirical evidence? What's the effect of a strike? What do we see?
The first thing we looked at is the very simple hypothesis that if people are overpaid, there should be more protest voting against them. So we developed a very basic model of who should be paid what based on size of the firm, the industry, profitability. And then we looked at over and above that, were people getting more? And you found that excess compensation definitely leads to protest voting. What's shown on the graph is that in the first strike vote, if you're overpaid by about $1 million, that's going to cost you on the order of 2%. It's a much stronger effect in the second round, that if you come up for a second strike vote, being overpaid by $1 million at the CEO level costs you about 9.5% of the votes. You could flip this around and ask the other question of how much would you have to be overpaid to lose this vote. So it's really how much would attract 25% protest voting against you. And you can see by the numbers that you'd have to be overpaid by something like $12 million just to lose because of compensation on the first strike. You'd have to be overpaid on the order of $2.5 to $3 million to lose the second strike. So it's obvious that the firms that do get a strike, it's not just the abnormal compensation that's driving this, because nobody's overpaid by the order of $12 million a year.
Interestingly enough, if the CEO is the chairman of the board, that's more likely to attract a strike. On the other hand, if you have a shareholder, a single shareholder who owns over 40% of the company's shares, then you're less likely to attract a strike against you, which I guess makes sense, because by then most people appreciate that the board is probably entrenched and has the major shareholder support.
That's a really interesting one about the significant shareholder. There are certainly a number of significant shareholders in some big companies in Australia. Are there any sort of individual cases that you think are quite interesting, and why is that?
Well, we had famously in 2011, Kerry Packer pointed out that he didn't care what the ordinary shareholders said, that if they voted against the pay, then he would simply use his majority stake in the Crown Casino to reappoint the boards of directors. And that's been a concern. So people have said, well, does this really matter in the long run? And for that, one way of checking that out is to look at the share price reaction. If it really didn't matter, then there shouldn't be a share market reaction. But in fact, we do find that the share market reaction is a significant one.
What you see is very clearly that it hurts the value of the company to lose one of these votes. In fact, to lose a first strike drops the value of the firm 4.5%. Losing a second strike is a further penalty of an additional 1% of market cap. So shareholders view the loss of the vote as a negative event. And to be honest, we're still trying to figure out why. That if there's protest against executive pay, one could argue that this is good news, that maybe the firm will spend less money going forward, have better contracting, and this would arguably raise the share price. But I think the market, one way or another, takes the loss of this vote as a sign of other trouble at these companies. And the fact that shareholders are able to organize themselves enough to protest at least to the extent of 25% against management signals that they have perhaps greater concerns about the firm.
Well, what's interesting about that is that the recidivist firms, that's the firms that get 2 or more strikes, as I said, some of them have up to 4, don't get as punished as much by the market as we might expect. And that might partly reflect that they are potentially a target of a future takeover bid, or they're expected to be a target of a takeover bid, which would be good news for the shareholders.
I think a simple explanation, though, is that if you lose this vote, it means that your communications with your stockholders simply has not been good on an ongoing basis. And that itself is a matter for concern. And that may ultimately be what investors generally are punishing.
Yeah. And on that point over there, it is the case that anecdotal evidence and what we see, and they talk about what happens to a CEO pay after a strike, indicates that the channel of communication is in fact improved. Managers of companies affected by a strike do seem to take greater efforts to communicate more clearly to shareholders why they structured the pay, to explain that. But even more importantly, they do seem to reduce the level of CEO pay.
You see that pay drops about 20% in the year after a firm gets a strike, and if it's a second strike, it drops by about a third for the CEO. So the very basic message that shareholders think the CEO is overpaid, this seems to be received loud and clear. Now, what you don't see are CEOs being removed from office or resigning in large number, for instance. It seems like there are penalties here, but whether these are enduring long-term penalties, it's too early to know. You may see downstreams a certain degree of ex post settling up that will maybe cut you next year, but an implicit contract to make you whole 2, 3, 4 years down the road.
Do you see any effects in terms of the structure of the pay? I mean, you're talking about total pay, but do you see any sort of variations in how much cash versus stock and options, etc.?
I think we looked at that and found very little change.
The total pay does seem to increase, but the structure, the shape of the pay doesn't seem to be as affected that much. And I guess that might simply reflect the reporting, that the way executive pay is now reported, it lends itself to a headline figure and so people aren't so much concerned about the shape. But related to that point, we do find that if a company is performing well, and often the case when they're performing well, then the CEO pay goes up because it's connected to the share price, then there's less of a strike. So in that sense, there is a connection between the shape of the pay, that is, when it's connected to share price, and the likelihood of receiving a strike.
So David and Ray, you've looked at the Australian context, obviously the international one. Is there any difference between the Australian and the internationals?
I think you've seen outcomes that are very similar, that in most countries, whatever the form of the law, there's overwhelming shareholder endorsement of what's being done. But the big differences are the consequences downstream. Australia is unique in really focusing on the board and spilling the board from office if there's a problem here. But the trend in other countries is to have a so-called mandatory approval of compensation. That when this began in the UK and in many other countries now like the US, it's strictly an advisory vote where there's no direct consequence if the vote is lost. But what you now see, Switzerland was the first country to move in this direction, and now Theresa May is talking about this in Britain, is that the approval of compensation would be mandatory by stockholders. Now, what is never specified is what exactly does this mean, and what are the consequences if the vote fails? Does it mean that the managers are supposed to give back last year's pay, or that they're supposed to work for free? It seems to lead to all kinds of contracting problems, that if you sign a new CEO from outside the firm and give him a contract, and then shareholders months later reject that contract, is the person then gone, or do you come for another vote? I think politically it's attractive to say that approval should be mandatory by stockholders, but nobody has succeeded in spelling out an internally consistent set of consequences. That the Swiss law in particular has been a nightmare for the parliament to implement. It was actually approved by popular vote of the whole country as an amendment to the national constitution of Switzerland, but Parliament now has to write enabling legislation to actually spell out what the consequences are, and they've really struggled with this. I would expect that if the British Parliament goes forward, as Theresa May has talked about, they'll run into similar issues of just having a very difficult time spelling out, what happens if you actually lose. This is really what's nice about Australia, because there's a well-defined set of outcomes, of votes triggering other votes. And as we said at the start, ultimately the focus is not on the managers for accepting the money, it's on the board for awarding the money. And I think that this is very important, that I'd like to see the Australian approach taken up by other countries. David, I think one thing that bears including here is the fact that a lot of these outcomes we just can't explain with the data. That we can look at profitability and compensation and the growth rates of different things. And ultimately, you explain maybe 20, 30, 40% of the outcomes, but a lot of this seems pretty idiosyncratic from one company to the next. Shareholders get angry and they see this as an opportunity for protest voting. But it's hard to link this directly to the data. This is not unusual in corporate finance. There's a lot of outcomes that are hard to explain, that seem almost random. But it's certainly characteristic of this area as well, that sometimes there's shareholder protest, and it's just not obvious to either side exactly what is being protested. And it may not be the compensation.
The other point I would add is that in some ways I think the public interest in executive remuneration is a proxy for the broader debate that we're having about wage and income inequality across the developed world. But people are looking at, it's easy to dramatize and make salient the disparity between CEO pay and, say, the average worker. So that becomes a focal point. I think that if we address this, then maybe we could go some way to addressing the wage inequality. But ironically, a lot of, particularly in Australia, where people have just about every working person has their money invested in superannuation funds, the better the firms do and the more effectively the CEOs are rewarded, the better everyone does. So it's not clear that addressing CEO remuneration is as big a deal in terms of that broader issue about income and wage inequality.
What you're seeing this year in the US is a new requirement that companies have to report the ratio between the CEO's pay and the pay of the median worker in the firm. And this, first of all, is just very difficult to calculate. Companies don't even know who their median worker is, and all kinds of issues about part-time employees and people working in other countries in a multinational firm. But even if you sort all that out, very little theory really guides you as to what that ratio should be. Should the CEO make 20 times, 80 times as much as the median worker? There's a lot of interest in how this data is going to look and how people are going to use it. But we're kind of amused from a distance at the whole effort, and producing a number that no one knows what it's supposed to be is sort of what's going on here. Switzerland, again, has had something interesting going on here. There was another constitutional amendment that was called the 12-to-1 rule, that it was stipulated that a CEO in any company couldn't make more than 12 times the pay of the minimum worker, not the median, but the very lowest paid person. And so that the inequality in any organization couldn't be any greater than 12-to-1 disparity. So this was brought up for a popular vote in the country, and it went down to a pretty ringing defeat by, I think, a margin of 70 to 30%, which I think was probably wise. But the inequality issue is certainly showing up in political campaigns all throughout the Western world, and executive pay, I think, as Raymond said, plays into this dynamic very much. And probably going to see more data, more debate about this, but not a lot of theory with which to understand it as yet.
So you're doing this CIFR research project. What are your sort of thoughts about follow-up work after this project is completed?
Certainly the following up on what happens to directors in the market for directors, that's a big concept in finance, but it's something that's bigger has more theory than empirical evidence against it. But now we have a situation where there's a clear vote of a clear indication of what shareholders think, and so we would like to see if there are consequences to those directors later on in line with the theory. That would be very useful. David?
I've been working in the area of shareholder voting for some time, and there's interesting procedural differences in how elections are organized and tracked in different countries around the world. I'd like to do more in this area. And I think in Australia specifically, block ownership, people taking large positions in firms and then voting their positions very strategically, is a topic that deserves a lot more scrutiny. I think you may well have situations where shareholders wish to trigger a first strike and even a second strike, but then draw the line and they don't really want to dump the board out of office. And understanding why they choose that course of action and what they're hoping to achieve by way of voting, what signals they're trying to send. This is a very interesting topic that is relevant. Australia has a nice setting to study this because of the structure of the two strikes rule, but it's important really in every country that has stock markets and public companies. I think shareholder voting is not well understood, and it's a nice research topic for people to be working in.
Superannuation in Australia is significant. It's the fourth largest asset pool globally. Also, there's a large reliance on proxy advisor organisations. And you may even argue that these super funds are relatively perhaps passive in the way they actually come to corporate governance. Can you maybe talk a bit about the role of like a passive type of investor or the influence that proxy firms are having?
It's costly for them to get involved. And you have to think, if you're invested in a superannuation fund, do you want the manager spending the resources to study these companies and cast the votes in a certain way? Is there really a return to the research and expensive activism. My own retirement plan in the US is in a very passive index fund, and somewhat to my chagrin, they actually do research and figure out how to vote. One way you can vote is just instruct the company to vote in the same proportion that other shareholders vote, and then free ride on the activists who have some comparative advantage in this area. I'm not so sure that fund managers generally have the capacity and should be spending the money to get involved in this. I think is an interesting question that it will affect people's returns on retirement savings. I think you might be able to free ride on the efforts of a few well-informed activists and let them be the catalyst for reform.
Well, David and Ray, thank you so much for spending some time detailing your research and your findings, and we look forward to seeing the final research delivered soon.
Thank you, and thank you for
David.
the support of CIFR. We're very grateful. It clearly has a role to play in the Australian regulatory regime.
Thank you.
Thank you.